And I agreed with them. Maybe the only thing I feared more than getting hurt myself was seeing somebody I loved get hurt. And everybody I loved was connected somehow to the Navy. "Frank, toss me another beer," Dad said, and I went to the cooler to fish one out of the half-melted ice. I worried about all the things that could go wrong. Lobbing a wet bottle at my dad, a vision of clunking him in the head with an 80-mile-an-hour submarine pitch came immediately to mind. But I swallowed my nervousness and threw him the bottle. It sailed through the air in a perfect arc, and Dad caught it without having to budge. He gave me an impressed smile as he popped the cap. It was silly, but I swelled with pride. Dad and I had never been close. He kept trying, taking me on father-son outings like going deep-sea fishing or climbing to the top of a volcano or flying around the islands in a Navy seaplane. But I was always too scared to enjoy myself. Still, I loved Dad for making the effort. He wasn't ready to give up on me, and I wasn't ready to give up on him. "What do you think about the war?" Mr. Summers asked, turning to Brooks. Brooks smiled. "I just want to finish my tour and come home and play baseball." "Nothing else?" Jenny asked flirtatiously. "Like start a family, maybe?" Brooks blushed, and the rest of us laughed. "She's got your number, kid," Dad said, giving Brooks the same smile he'd given me. I clearly wasn't the only one who hoped Brooks and Jenny would get married. "Well," Mr. Summers said, taking a sip from his bottle, "we'll be fighting the Japanese over here before we know it." "You think so?" I asked, my stomach tying itself into a knot. Jenny shrugged. Why else would Uncle Sam have sent Dad to Hawaii? I knew that my dad and the rest of the Pacific Fleet had been moved to Pearl Harbor because Japan had invaded half of Asia while everybody else was busy with Germany. Now the radio said that the Japanese were threatening to expand east toward the United States. But I hoped it wouldn't come to war. Dad shook his head. "No way. Pearl is a fortress. They'll never attack here." Standing in the shadow of the gigantic battleships parked offshore, it was hard to disagree with him. Each dreadnought was as long as the Washington Monument laid on its side, and their steel hulls rose tall and gray like skyscrapers. The Arizona, the Tennessee, the West Virginia, the Oklahoma, the Maryland, and those were just the ones I could see from where I stood. Everybody called it Battleship Row. To me, it was a lineup of superheroes, as big and powerful as the Justice Society of America, and it sat 200 yards from my back door. Dad flipped the burgers with the spatula, making flames shoot up as grease dripped onto the coals. "Frank, grab the buns behind the cooler and lay them on the grill to toast," he said. To anybody else, that might have been a simple request, but for me, it triggered a quiet panic. Put hamburger buns on the grill? With my bare hands? What if the charcoal flared up and scorched me? What if I accidentally touched the grill and burned my fingers? What if hamburger grease popped into my eyes and blinded me? I took a bun out of the bag and got as close as I dared to the heat radiating off the grill. I held the bun as far away from me as I could and nudged it onto the grill. I didn't nudge it far enough, though, and it fell onto the grass. "Frank," Dad said. "Well, I'm in no hurry to fight anybody," Mr. Summers said, going on like I hadn't been asked to risk my life for the sake of a toasted bun. I pulled another bun from the bag and took careful aim and gave this one an underhanded toss like I had with Dad's beer. It sailed through the air and landed perfectly between two hamburgers. "Ha! What about helping the people of Europe?" Jenny asked Mr. Summers. "Your dad said it. This is paradise," Mr. Summers argued. "Why would we give that up to go fight in somebody else's war?" I took out another bun and held it ready. I focused on where I wanted it to land, and I flipped it end over and toward the grill. The bun slipped perfectly between the grates and landed right on top of the coals, where it burst into flames. "Oh, for crying out loud, Frank," Dad said, giving me an exasperated look. He took the bag of buns from me, and in 10 seconds flat, he had the rest of them laid out on the grill by hand. I shrank away, Dad's earlier pride in me gone like the tide. I didn't have to look at her to know Jenny was rolling her eyes. "How's the food coming?" Mom called from the door. "We're starving in here." "Everybody go on in," Dad said, piling hamburgers on a plate. "I'll be right there." I followed Mr. Summers and Brooks inside slowly, nervous about seeing Stanley again. Jenny held me back and gave me the stink eye. "Whatever's going on between you and Stanley, fix it," she whispered. I nodded. I would fix it if Stanley let me. After I got cleaned up, I went to the dining table. I liked the little alcove where it was set, because that's where Stanley's mom displayed her Japanese family heirlooms. There were colored woodblock prints of Mount Fuji, a famous snow-covered volcano just outside Tokyo, framed sepia-toned pictures of Mrs. Summers' Japanese ancestors, the men and women wearing kimonos and looking serious, and the real showstopper, an honest-to-goodness samurai sword with a fancy diamond pattern hilt and a polished lacquer scabbard. I couldn't help but stare at it. "That katana belonged to my great-great-grandfather," Mrs. Summers told me proudly as she sat down. "My grandfather brought the sword with him when he moved to Hawaii." I nodded. I knew most of the story because Stanley loved to show off the katana to anyone and everyone who visited. It was rare for Japanese Americans to live on base. Most of the servicemen and their families here at Pearl Harbor were white. Off base, though, it was almost the opposite. There were way more Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders than there were white people in the rest of Hawaii. There, my family and I were the minority. Stanley slunk into the room and sat down at the table. Our mom had cleaned him up and he changed his shirt, but he had a big black bruise around his left eye that didn't look like it was going away anytime soon. "Ouch," my dad said, sitting across from Stanley. "I hope the other guy looks worse." Stanley shrugged. "I tried," he said, and Frank didn't. The unspoken truth lurked between us like Kent Thurston, the invisible road. There was only one seat left for me at the table, and that was next to Stanley. He didn't look up at me as I sat down, staring at the empty plate in front of him instead. The silence that surrounded Stanley and me grew bigger and bigger until it swallowed the adults at the table too. I could sense them looking at each other and wondering what was wrong, but knowing better than to ask. Jenny was right. I needed to fix this. I wanted to fix this, but I didn't know how. Not without telling Stanley everything, which could mean losing him for good. "Hey guys," Brooks said to Stanley and me, acting like he couldn't tell there was something going on. "Why don't you both come by the Utah tomorrow morning before the big baseball championship? I'll give you a tour of the ship, and then we can go to the game together. What do you say?" I didn't know whose idea it was, his or Jenny's, but the invitation was clearly designed to bring Stanley and me back together. I hardly ever got to set foot on a working battleship, so I should have been excited by Brooks' offer. Would have been excited, except that I was too busy worrying that I'd lost my best friend. "That'd be swell," I said flatly. "Sure, Brooks," said Stanley. "Thanks." Our answers seemed to make the adults think everything was fixed, and they got to passing the food around and talking about the war again. It was my turn to say something to Stanley, to explain why I'd let him fight Arthur and Johnny alone, but I couldn't do it. "Hey," I said instead, "maybe the Arsenal's original story has to do with him being a sailor on a battleship. We could use something on our tour tomorrow to put in our comic." "Really, Frank?" said Stanley. He looked at me for the first time since the fight, and this time it was like I was a stranger. "How do you think you can write about heroes if you can't be one yourself?"